Alright, welcome to another history revision stream. Tomorrow we are doing a mock on Margaret Thatcher. So what I thought we would do today is literally go over as many things as possible to do with Thatcher. We're going to go over all of the economic policies, the social impact, everything like that. Because the question we've been given, the extract question, talks about how convincing do you find the view that the achievements of the Thatcher government were startling? It's talking about achievements. That means we need to be able to talk about everything. The economic achievements, the social achievements, the achievement in terms of shaping things like New Labour. So all of that is going to be talked about today. So, I first want to go over the extracts and pick out details and kind of talk about them. The first thing I was able to pick out is it talks about Thatcher's anti-inflationary strategy, where inflation came down to 21.9% to 2.4%. Now that is a very startling number. That is a great amount of inflation reduced. However, what this extract fails to account is in Thatcher's first term, due to monetarism, inflation does go up, the monetarist policies, which we'll talk more about in a little. The next thing it talks about is government borrowing fell steadily, government revenue exceeded expenditure. So, government revenue. And that is obviously due to the policies of privatisation. How have I spelled privatisation wrong? Oh my god. Privatisation. Denationalisation of certain things. I don't recall what specifically. I guess if you had to give an example, you could say like British gas, possibly. Privatised. Reforms were enacted which curbed union power and allowed industry, forcibly slimmed down by recession to improve productivity. So, there it is mentioning, firstly, the effect of unions. Union power declines because she curb stomps the strikes. She limits union power. That is an achievement. However, it then talks about the limitations of this, how they were forcibly slimmed down. That highlights a limitation, how actually industry fell. Many manufacturing jobs were lost. Things like the north-south divide grew even further, with a lot of jobs in the north being completely lost. Obviously, going back to privatisation, it's this idea of supplied-side economics, which is basically kind of contradicts in a way. Basically, it contradicts because, well, yeah, she is spending less money on the government and therefore revenue increases. You have to also account the fact that more money was put into the NHS, more money was put into policing. Therefore, there is actually more government spending instead of the opposite. So, already we have talked about the achievements. So these could be whole separate paragraphs, really. The idea that her privatisation was a success because it made the government more revenue. However, the limitation to that is the supply-side economics kind of failed because more money was spent on the NHS, more money was spent on policing overall. You could talk about the decline of inflation, which is a massive achievement. However, you could also talk about the limitations to this being monetarism. The idea that in her first term, inflation did rise. It wasn't until her second term. Therefore, it's a limit. Talk about the achievement of limiting union power. However, this achievement is massively overshadowed by a decline in industry, which forcibly slimmed down many manufacturing jobs. During the second government, the economic recovery accelerated. Unemployment started to fall. Large-scale privatization proceeded at a swift pace. Losses were replaced with profits, which benefited the taxpayer. Wider share ownership supplemented with the large social changes, such as the sale of council houses. That is an important one. Sale of council houses. Because there you could talk about how things like owning shares, these mainly only benefited the middle class. The working class couldn't benefit as much from the sale of council houses. So this mainly only affected the middle class. The reduction of income tax rates increased incentives for high earners to stay and work in Britain, reducing tax avoidance and increasing the flow of revenue. So again, linking to the idea of revenue increasing because of lower taxes. However, lower taxes primarily benefited the wealthy. And we should probably try and find a statistic for this. I don't know whether it was like 25% to 21% maybe. But for the lower class, it was a very small decrease. Then. Miss Thatcher deliberately made British industry and workers face reality and adapt to it. Despite occasional setbacks, that could be a quote we use, occasional setbacks, talking about this maybe, there was a clear and consistent strategy to revive Britain's economic strength and internalise standing. The most decisive political recognition is that Tony Blair made great public play of continuing the broad economic policies they were startling. So, that is talking about New Labour. The idea that Tony Blair adapted a lot of Thatcher's policies, such as privatisation, which is significant. Tony Blair focusing on maintaining unemployment instead of, dealing with it. So therefore, this would be a massive argument for yes, the achievements were startling, because New Labour reflected Thatcher's achievements, her successes in privatisation, her successes of owning shares, benefiting the middle class, her successes of anti-inflation and a rise of unemployment. Now let's look at the second extract and see what it counters or what it adds to. The British economy during the Thatcher years had its ups and downs. Inflation had decreased. Deregulation of banks and building societies expanded consumer credit. That is a huge one. Consumer credit. Because we can talk about the limitation of that being a massive rise in personal debts, which links to the sale of council houses and owning shares. Many also appreciated Thatcher because she made it possible for them to purchase their council houses at a discount. On the other hand, Thatcher presided over a permanent loss of 2 million high-paid jobs. This is where we link in. 2 million plus high-paid jobs. That's because she forcibly slimmed down the industry. The division between the wealthy South and poorer North widened. With the gradual decline of British manufacturing, it was mostly northern, formerly unionised men. So that there is going to be our contrast, okay? Here, the first extract is talking about how she forcibly slimmed down the industry, but her achievement was limiting union power. In the second extract, it's saying that Thatcher, the limitation of union power, reducing union power, was a bad thing. It wasn't an achievement, because it widened the North-South divide, formerly unionised men lost manufacturing jobs, and overall 2 million lost high-paying jobs. That could be a whole paragraph. The first extract is arguing that unions, the reduction of union power, making them face reality, it says. However, on the second one, it's saying that they didn't have to face reality. Instead, they were just completely left out of jobs. The result of privatisation were mixed. Some of the most bureaucratic public services seemed to benefit, but privatisation also created monopolies. So that's talking about the limitation of privatisation. Monopolies. The British economy during... By 1990, Britain had sunk back into economic depression with high interest rates. Thatcher had made targeting inflation a central part of her policy. Now inflation was again at a high level, calling into question the sacrifices. Household unemployment hovered at about 20%, and the number of poor people doubled. So that is again talking about how inflation actually rose. So, these are our notes on Thatcher. Let's now pick this apart. How would we structure paragraphs about this? Let's go have a look at let's look at the mark scheme to see what it's telling us to do. Right, firstly, it's saying this is the points made by the authors, so we should consider these. If we haven't wrote them down, let's do it. Inflation was reduced, we've mentioned that. Tax rates fell and the tax take increased, while government borrowing fell and ultimately run a surplus. I talked about how the government made a revenue instead of a loss. Productivity grew and employment fell. So actually, we could have linked further to the point of unemployment falling after a while. See, I would have said monetarism did come with the side effect of increased unemployment. However, the first source argues that, okay. Sale of council houses contributed to the growth of home ownership. I didn't link to home ownership. It's a very generic thing to say, but the sale of council housing led to an increase in home ownership. Owning shares primarily benefited the middle class. Labour politicians such as Blair continued these successful policies. Again, that would be a paragraph. 2 million relatively high-paid manufacturing jobs were lost. This is the effect of limiting the strike, so we talked about that. The divisions between the North and South grew. Privatisation brought short-term benefits but led to monopolies, and again, we've talked about that. By the end of Thatcher's period, economic policies have returned. Therefore, we should argue overall, for our conclusion, she did have some startling achievements. Talk about union power being limited, privatisation. However, overall, we're going to argue that these were very short-term achievements. Privatisation led to a monopoly. By the end of Thatcher's term, there was again a rise in unemployment, a rise in inflation, therefore suggesting that her inflationary strategy, which she adopted in the 80s, was not effective long term. You could talk about how, yeah, her achievements with New Labour were significant in influencing that. Her achievement of the sale of council houses did lead to, an increase in home ownership. But I would probably say my overall point for this essay is going to be, it was a very short-term achievement. Let's see what else the mark scheme says. So this is our knowledge. The reduction of trade union power reduced the number of days lost to strikes and created a more Okay, so the only thing I've mentioned there is making them face reality. We should probably put the, reduced number of days lost. That's a very good thing to put in any Thatcher essay, because you obviously you need to talk about the pros and cons. Yes, you reduce union power, but what does that actually mean in regular terms? It means that the number of days lost to strikes is going to run low. Policies such as privatisation, tax cuts and deregulation increase the level of shared ownership among the working and middle class. Deregulation of industries brought increased competitiveness, lower costs and improved services. That is an interesting point. Monopolies, but the benefit of monopolies, which I haven't talked about actually, is it makes them more modern. Instead of being these nationalised industries that are very old and, I don't have a word really, but basically privatisation did come with the benefit of modernising a lot of industries. So again, that's a positive. An achievement. Consumer capitalism had served to erode class differences. I might not really talk about that. The consequences of economic restructuring towards a growing service sector contributed to economic growth. And these are counter-arguments. Unemployment reached 3 million by 1983 and never fell to pre-Thatcher years until after 1997. That is a significant statistic. The unemployment was at 3 million. So yeah, she declined inflation thanks to monetarism, but the downside of that is 3 million unemployed. There was a growth of poverty in particular groups, the loss of manufacturing jobs, lower wages in which work, widened the gap between those who did and didn't share. So that's an idea there that many didn't share the boom, Thatcher's boom, or the Lawson boom. The impact of high interest rates required to control inflationary boom and the subsequent recession. So yeah, it refers to the Lawson boom, but you have to talk about things like the Black Monday, where there was a significant crash. Economic and associated social problems were more evident in regions hard hit by deindustrialisation. Coalfields of South Wales, parts of Midland and the North. So, let us go now. I have this pen. Let us go finally group this all together. This is kind of a wild way to do this, but right. So, our three main paragraphs for this essay are gonna be, firstly, talking about how the achievements of reducing inflation, because remember, it's saying the achievements of the Thatcher government were startling. We need to argue, were they startling, were they not? Did she have achievements, did she not? This would be an achievement, the decline of inflation. However, we're going to contrast that by talking about what it says in the second paragraph, how over time inflation began to rise again, suggesting her inflationary strategies were ineffective, talking about how due to it being a monetarist policy, unemployment rose. It rose to 3 million in 1984, I want to say, or 86. So a side effect of her achievement is unemployment. 20% unemployed by the end of her term. So that would be a first paragraph. Then for the second paragraph, I'll talk about privatisation. The idea of it being supply-side economics and how, like the first paragraph said, it led to a surplus due to the budget cuts. However, things like the NHS and policing did not face budget cuts. Thatcher actually had to spend more government money on those. Things like tax cuts were allowed because of privatisation, but they mainly benefited the wealthy. Monopolies were created, which is a side effect. However, we'll contrast that as well by saying they became more modern. Then, finally, a whole paragraph on unions. The idea that unions had to face reality This reduced the number of days lost to strikes by curbing union power. However, this also came with the effect of forcibly slimming down union power. Industry jobs. Manufacturing jobs were lost, over 2 million, and they were mainly formerly unionized men, as the second source says. It also suggests there was a widening in the north-south divide due to the deindustrialization. And overall, many did not share Thatcher's loss and boom. Finally, the sale of council houses, we could probably sprinkle that in just in one of those paragraphs. How that only benefited the middle class. Could probably link it to that. Talk about how her achievement with new labour was a success. Talk about how consumer credit led to increased personal debt, but did erode class boundaries. So, I'm going to rub this off and I'm going to make it neat now. Monetarist policies, Totty's rocking steadily, shopping. I keep it on. You get me right. So, the achievements and the I guess the consequences. Her achievement, firstly, we'll talk about them in the most obvious order that they come to my mind. Firstly, union power. The decline of union power. That is an achievement because it reduces the number of workdays lost to strikes. The consequences of this: it widens the north-south divide. The source says that there are 2 million, what does it say, professional jobs? 2 million high-paid jobs. High-paid manufacturing. Because it's the deindustrialization which is going to benefit manufacturing, well, going to disadvantage manufacturing jobs. Ups and downs. Permanent loss of 2 million high-paid jobs, the division between the wealthy South, and also obviously talk about how most of the people affected by the reduce of manufacturing jobs were formerly unionized men. So that is the first paragraph. The decline of union power did reduce the number of workdays lost to strikes, which is an achievement. However, the consequences of that were this. We can link that to source 2, talk about how it made them face reality and adapt, as the first source says. The first source also suggests, actually, you know what, we'll just put source 1 and 2. Source 1, source 2. Made them face reality and adapt. However, it also says that industry improved productivity. But it was forcibly slimmed down by a recession. The next thing we'll talk about is monetarism. The idea that inflation reduced from, I'm just going to round, 21% to 2%. However, of course, we need to mention the fact that inflation returned to a high in the 90s, therefore proving her anti-inflationary strategy was ineffective. Talk about how inflation, in fact we'll do that on a separate one. I'm pretty happy, honestly. I was going to keep the stream going, but honestly I might just stop there, because this is plenty, but we'll keep going just for a tad. The idea of unemployment, the source says unemployment, it doesn't mention unemployment, but that is something to talk about. Unemployment rose to 3 million plus. Because it's a monetarist policy. Monetarism / supply side economics. Then obviously the second source talks about this a lot, talks about how inflation returned to high rates. To add to this, 20% of people were unemployed. Talk about obviously the benefit of reduced inflation led to a tax cuts, but they only benefited the middle class. Oh, obviously a big one here, cuts to benefits. Then finally is government spending. Obviously the first source says that they were in a surplus. They were making more money. Making more than they were earning due to things like privatization. This obviously enabled modernization of industry. However, it also led to a monopoly. Also talk about how government spending was limited because she spent more money on the police / NHS. And I honestly think that would be more than enough. We've talked about her achievement. Achievement 1, curbing union power. Achievement 2, cutting inflation. Achievement 3, limiting government spending. And obviously we will link this to New Labour, which maintained the policy of denationalisation, highlighting its achievement. Obviously, we could talk here about how the cut in inflation also led to things like council houses getting, as the first source says, a discount. Well, the second source says it's a discount. So I think this is a decent amount. Hopefully tomorrow when I write this up, I'll remember a lot of this. There's not a lot of my own knowledge on this. Literally most of it is common sense. The first source says how union power declined, and that's a good thing, and they can face reality and adapt and improve productivity. However, it did this by forcibly slimming down manufacturing jobs. It obviously reduced the number of days lost to strikes, but this led to a loss of manufacturing jobs, mainly northern formerly unionised men. Over 2 million high-paid manufacturing jobs were lost, and a north-south divide continued. Also, Thatcher cut benefits. Second one, talking about inflation, and this is mainly good, talking about her achievements to cut inflation. They were limited because they did return, and many remained unemployed due to these monetarist policies. However, a reduction in inflation led to a rise in interest rates, led to tax cuts, but they only benefited the wealthy, but also it led to a discount of council houses, as the second source says. Finally, the third paragraph I'll talk about is the idea of government spending. The government spending being in a surplus, making more money than they were spending. Due to privatisation, it enabled the modernisation of old industries. This is reflected in New Labour, which continued with denationalisation. However, the limits to this were that there was a monopoly created by privatisation, and also a limitation because Thatcher did end up spending more government spending on the NHS and the police, which is something she said she wouldn't. So overall, you could argue her achievements were significant for limiting union power, reducing inflation, and limiting government spending. However, you could argue that these effects were short-term, these achievements. You could argue they're short-term because it led to a greater rise in unemployment, especially to formerly unionised people. You could talk about how it widened social divisions. The tax cuts didn't help the lower class. Council houses didn't help the lower classes. You could talk about how her inflationary strategy was ineffective. And then finally talk about how, yes, privatisation was a good policy. However, it was limited by things like monopolies. And overall, Thatcher went back on her word and spent more money. So that's all I'm going to do for today, guys. Hope this was helpful. And yeah,